Hi, this is Chuck Wolf, and you're listening to the Emotion Roadmap, Take the Wheel and Control How You Feel on WPKN 89.5, listener-supported community radio. And I'm pleased to have with me this morning a guest I'm going to tell you a little bit about in a moment, John Woods. He is a national ambassador for a group called Braver Angels. And I'll say a little bit about them in a moment, but I also want to talk about them in context with what I've been trying to do on the radio show. Those of you who are regular listeners know that the goal of the show is to help people with challenging situations that involve emotions, strong emotions. A lot of us have difficulties sometimes solving problems. Really good, excellent critical thinkers struggle at times when strong emotions are involved, either inside yourself or with somebody that you're dealing with. You're worried about emotions escalating or just what emotions you might create, depending on what you're going to say or do. So the show has been focused in part in recent years on politics because it's been so toxic in so many families and among friendships that people have stopped talking to each other in many cases. And as a way of helping people to control their emotions, to do more emotionally, to have more inner peace with their ability to manage their emotions, I have looked for ways to help individuals who call in at times. Other times I've had guest speakers on who introduce what I think is really helpful information that really relates to many of us in terms of helping us to be more effective at dealing with challenging situations involving strong emotions. And some of you have heard me talk in the past about a group called No Labels that I've been very active with in the last few years. One of the things that's happened in No Labels, which has a mission, by the way, to create bipartisanship, and in creating bipartisanship with elected officials, No Labels has had a major impact on this group that's called the Problem Solvers Caucus, who many people didn't know about, but in recent months have learned about. This is a group of people who are elected representatives in the House of Representatives who come in as partners to this caucus. You can't come in alone. You have to come in with a partner from the other party. So you have to be a Republican coming in with a Democrat or a Democrat coming in with a Republican. And when you come in, you sign a pledge. And the pledge is about a willingness to support good, effective legislation that 70% of the people in the caucus believe is the right legislation for the country. And at least 50% of the Republicans and at least 50% of the Democrats all agree that this is a good piece of legislation worth voting on. And the reasons that's important is because sometimes a party, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, might be telling their members not to vote for that legislation for party reasons, for political reasons that go against the country's best interest. And so it's really hard for people to stand up and have the courage. But by coming in as a group, and now they have as many as 56 members. And this group, along with some senators who have a different way of working together, but they also are working collaboratively across the aisle, we're the ones responsible for the most recent COVID package. Many of you may remember Joe Manchin, Susan Collins, and others, and Josh Gottheimer from the House of Representatives, and Tom Reed from the House of Representatives, a Democrat and a Republican, standing up and speaking in December saying it's unconscionable to go home without some kind of support package for the American people. They're in dire need, and it just is the wrong thing for us to go home. Their leaders in both parties did not support their efforts. This was a groundswell, and they got people to pay attention, and they got something passed. And that's why they're more well known today than they have been in the past. Well, No Labels is a group that has actively supported getting people together and forming this initial caucus, and now these bicameral meetings with House and senators who are working across the aisle. So I've been promoting them on my radio show because I think if you feel like you want to make a difference and you feel kind of helpless as an individual, but you want to be part of an organization, feel free to contact me if you want to join No Labels. You can reach me at my email. Many of you know it, but I'll give it again. It's cjwolfe@cjwolfe.com. So No Labels has been out there doing this work with the representatives, but there's also a group that I more recently discovered in the last couple of years called Braver Angels. At one point, they were called Better Angels. And the Braver Angels is a group that has a mission that's aligned with bipartisanship in a way, but it's more about civility and respect, about people talking with each other who they categorize sometimes as red and blue. Red being Republican typically, blue being Democrat. I guess there's purple too, but the idea of people who are on opposite sides being able to talk to each other And I thought, this is really what I was going after when I first started with this, because I just think family is so important. It's really, really sad when family members have stopped talking to each other and really aren't willing to raise a conversation about how they're feeling about things that are important to talk about in terms of the direction the country is taking, because they're afraid that things will get worse between them, or they've actually stopped talking altogether. And I know of friendships that have broken up. I've actually talked about that on other shows. But Braver Angels has as its mission, it seems, to have people be able to talk to each other, even when they disagree, strongly disagree, and yet also strongly respect each other and be very civil with one another. So as a member in No Labels, I've been working very actively in a group that was focused on media support for the No Labels group as a volunteer. We're doing other things now too. But I ran across the name of John Wood, and John's background is really fascinating. We had a wonderful chat the other day, and I'm going to ask him to share some of that with you today. But he was working in part with media, but he is also the Braver Angels National Ambassador. And so I thought it'd be great to have him on to talk to you and to introduce to all of our listeners what Braver Angels purports to do and how successful they are. I sat in on a meeting the other night that had 4,500 people on a Zoom call. I mean, it was remarkable how many people attended, and people didn't drop off. It was extremely powerful. It was also shortly after the horrific events of January 6th, but it was an amazing presentation. And I heard a couple of amazing speakers, and perhaps along the way, I'll share a little bit about that. But I don't want to wait any longer. I want to just introduce John to you and ask John if he'll tell us a little bit about his story, how he got connected to No Labels. And how we got connected to Braver Angels, and then we'll roll into what Braver Angels is, and what their past is, their present, and what their future is about. So, John, thanks so much for being here with us, and I appreciate you taking the time today. And you're up, and can you start with telling us what seems to be most relevant to you as you're listening?
Yeah, absolutely. Chuck, thank you very much, first of all, for having me on the show. Yeah, pleased to have gotten to know you a little bit going into this, and your framing about sort of the importance of our being able to regulate our emotional and psychological centers as a way of navigating difficult conversations and imparting that skill set and that foundation to others really does speak to what it is we seek to do at Braver Angels. And so I'm hoping we can get into that a bit. But how did I get involved with Braver Angels to begin with? So that is a long story. Let me give you an abbreviated version that sort of wraps up some of my biography. I come from a sort of, I guess you could say, a biracial, a bipartisan, and multicultural family. My mother is a liberal Black Democrat from inner city Los Angeles. My father's a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. Now, Dad didn't become a Republican until later in life, but he was always sort of the traditionalist in our family, raised me to focus on the importance of traditional American values, so on and so forth. There are a number of conservative themes that came my way by way of my father. My mother came from a very different experience, different generation, so on and so forth. My father's family was very wealthy. My mother's family has many, many success stories, but comes from much sort of more humble roots. And so I grew up at the intersection of, sort of socioeconomic forces, I guess you could say. And so I grew up very interested in politics, thought of myself very much as sort of a liberal Democrat, and was an activist in high school. Worked very hard for Barack Obama's campaign in 2008. I believed in the idea of hope and change as being very much about creating sort of a post-partisan, post-racial America, if you will. So after Obama was elected, I took it upon myself to start studying conservatism, to start reaching out to Republicans. And after doing that for some time, after reading books I'd never read before, Wealth of Nations, Atlas Shrugged, and some other things happened, I sort of went through a religious conversion, got married to a woman from a traditional sort of Black Baptist background, moved to a military town. My friends were soldiers, joined a faith-based community for the first time in my life. I looked up one day and I realized, on a list of 100 issues, I'm sort of a bit right of center on maybe 62 of them or so. And made me realize, I guess I'm a bit of a conservative myself, which was an uncomfortable feeling because, the idea of being a liberal Democrat was so close to my my sense of identity. But the thing that had not changed in me was the desire to be a part of building a bridge between left and right, black and white. I still wanted to do that. That was unchanged. I remained sort of inspired by what I considered to be Obama's message in that original campaign. And so I thought, how can I be a part of the conversation? I made a decision to run for Congress when we moved back to Los Angeles. We had moved to Colorado. My wife was at Fort Carson in Colorado Springs. We ultimately moved back to Los Angeles. I ran for Congress against Maxine Waters in 2014. That's how I got my start in politics. And I ran very much as a hope and change Republican, if you can believe that. I was a person who had a more conservative kind of policy agenda, but the idea of sort of emphasizing that this isn't red or blue America or black, white, or Latino America as much as it is the United States of America. That was very much sort of my message, and I got to tell stories from my family, both sides of my family, as a way of making that real for people, as a way of humanizing, the faces of people on both sides of that divide. And so I tried to bring that perspective to partisan politics, and I didn't have a lot of luck. I was elected vice chairman of the Republican Party of Los Angeles in, I guess it was late 2014, was there for about a year and a half or so. Really got to see a lot of internal kind of nastiness in the GOP, and I'm sure it would have been the same in the Democratic Party. When the when the Trump movement came into town, that was sort of the last signal I needed that, the things I'm trying to do are probably not best done in this space. And so I set about launching a digital media network that was meant to sort of highlight voices from across the spectrum, people who disagreed about politics, but who agreed about how we ought to treat each other in politics. Had some headaches trying to get that going, but learned a lot about what it would take to be able to message sort of a narrative of shared American identity that could bring folks together. And about a certain amount of time into that project, a friend of mine who was a volunteer with no labels at the time, actually, pointed out to me the existence of a group called Better Angels. And when I looked at Better Angels, I saw an organization that espoused the values I believed in, the idea that democracy, ultimately our political culture, is strengthened by our ability to achieve empathetic and personal connection with each other. They were creating the space in local communities for people to dialogue across their differences and to continue in relationship with each other. All things that were so needed in my view, but they seem to not be thinking too much about YouTube and social media and creating content and so forth to amplify that culture. So I kind of brought that idea to Better Angels. I drove down with my friend Luke Phillips. We drove down to participate in the workshop in San Diego, met the founders of Better Angels, David Blankenhorn, Bill Doherty, Peter Yarrow, Peter, Paul, and Mary, who's a friend of the organization. He was there at that workshop. And, told David a bit about my idea for the media side of things. We had a few more conversations, and ultimately they brought me on to sort of help build out the media presence of Better Angels. I stepped into sort of a spokesman type role, an ambassador role for the organization, interfacing with going on radio shows, podcasts, television, and whatnot, talking about the work of the group, the larger movement towards creating reconciliation in the country. And the rest, as they say, is history. I came on board officially in spring of 2018. And even though it's only January of 2021, Chuck, that feels like it was a couple of lifetimes ago, given everything that's happened to us as a country between then and now. But yeah, that's the arc of the story.
Well, okay, I guess before we jump to Braver Angels and some of what they're doing, some thoughts as I listen to you tell your story, John. It seems to me you are the bridge, right? I mean, just what you've lived, who you are, how you came about, how you came into being, and my guess is are you having to use your skills within your family units and across the different groups of communities that you belong to? I imagine you're tasked to do that on occasion.
Well, I've always sort of operated as something of a translator and interpreter, sort of, across cultural and other divides. And yeah, I mean, that's always been just sort of a function of how I grew up. just sort of the need to do that, in part as a means of perhaps finding a greater sense of understanding who I was. I mean, my parents' marriage did not last. They separated when I was fairly young, and it didn't have really anything to do with politics per se, but the cultural sorts of differences between folks like my mother and my father that inform our greater political divisions in America were very much present, in the friction of the home I grew up in. And I mean, I can remember sort of being, it's sort of, I guess, a sad thing to say, but I can remember being a little kid, and both my parents are both, strong, forceful personalities, and I can remember them sort of, arguing and screaming at each other in the living room. And I can remember being, 3 or 4 years old and sort of running in the middle of them and putting my hands on my ears and screaming at them, shouting, "Stop shouting at each other," shouting at them to stop shouting at each other. And somebody sort of provoked that memory in me not too long ago. And when I told the story, I realized, well, I guess I've sort of been doing that ever since, haven't I? And so, yeah, I'm a person who has been blessed to be fairly able to walk into very different cultural environments and relate to people, because I have perhaps such a spectrum of perspectives and starting points in my family that it's never been too terribly difficult for me to see the humanity in folks. But part of what I guess also came with that was a real valuing of listening, the act of listening, and trying to listen deeply, not just listen to, what's the technical meaning of the words that this person is speaking, but what is the emotion, what is the feeling that is carrying the words that are being spoken here, and how does that tell me more about where this person is coming from and who this person is, and how should that inform how it is I communicate in response, right? And so, that way of being, I think, was cultivated in me sort of early on, because I was never carrying just one cultural language or the other with me. I always had sort of different narratives operating in my mind kind of at all times, because my mother's world was very different from my father's world. My mother's way of explaining the world, explaining reality, very different from my father's, and vice versa. And so I always had to compare back and forth. And comparing between the perspectives and worldviews of people who I loved dearly, who were the people responsible for my existence. And so I could never be too partial, really, in any direction. And so, yeah, that that way of moving through life was with me, I think, before I realized that perhaps it was somewhat distinct in some ways, maybe. So yeah, that that's the imagery there.
Yeah, so it seems like sometimes some of the things that happen to us as children, I think, get to be played out later on in life in terms of the lives that we choose to lead. I know, as you talked about your family, I won't say much about this, but I will say that in my own family, my parents loved each other. They did stay together, but they fought a lot. And one of the things that I noticed when they fought was they didn't really hear each other. They did. I mean, across the words were messages. There was love there. And there was misunderstanding. And even as a young kid, I was able to try to tease out that, hey, wait a minute, you're not really hearing each other. Now, they didn't always listen to me either, but I was there trying, and that's actually what I've been doing ever since in some ways. Well, okay, let's talk a little bit about Braver Angels then. So in terms of the organization itself, in your role of national ambassador for them, what's the sort of like the elevator speech, if you will? What do you say to people when they want to know, so what is Braver Angels? What do they do, and why do they matter, and why should I care, I guess?
Sure, right. Well, the elevator speech is this. So Braver Angels is the largest grassroots bipartisan organization in America, working on the issue of political polarization, or working towards political depolarization. But when we say depolarization, we really mean something a little bit more than just tamping down on the hostility. What we mean is creating a sense of shared, unearthing a sense of deeper American values and shared American identity in an effort to renew the spirit of democracy, really. in a way that allows us to begin looking at democracy and politics, generally speaking, as a project within which we move through our relationships to achieve the common good, right? And so that begins, therefore, with tending to our relationships. We see a distinct and vital connection between the health of the relationships that exist between the American people, between you and your parents, between husbands and wives, neighbors, classmates, people in the workplace, you and your pastor, whatever the case may be, that there is a direct relationship between the health of our relationships and the health of our institutional society, right? And the reason for that is because our institutions, one, they are all made up of people who are in relationship with each other. And the question is simply, are those relationships working? Are they functional? Are they based on a certain degree of respect, understanding, and most importantly, trust? Or are they not? Are they based on distrust? Are they rooted in a sort of animosity and an unwillingness to understand or really take into account the emotional starting points that motivate people on the other side of a given question, the moral foundations that are operative in people's thinking and actions on the other side of a question? If it's the former, if there is a fabric of trust that exists between people, regardless of their differences, then people operating in the institutions and, in the sort of structures and machinery of American life, we may come to points at which it becomes difficult for us to agree on particular things, but we will nevertheless play by the rules. We will nevertheless operate in a way to where we contribute to the integrity of the workings of Congress, the workings of the court. The media will operate in a way that is more intellectually honest and fair-minded. We will be invested in the larger integrity of the workings of our institutions because we will agree that there are certain metrics for progress and stability, for success in our society, that go beyond whether or not one partisan group wins an argument today or the other, but that is reflected in our ability to continue to have the argument in a functioning and operational sort of way over time, because our systems hold together, because we are committed to making sure that the rules work and that folks play by the rules, because we have a respect and a trust for one another. When that trust dissolves, then our presence in the institutions, then our activities in democracy become less about preserving the integrity of our institutions, less about preserving the culture that we continue to dialogue with each other through over time, and becomes more about how can I use the machinery of the state to undermine my opponent, even if I have to bend the rules? How can I use my megaphone through the media to smash and destroy my political opponents, regardless of whether or not I have to take shortcuts in terms of how I present the facts or how I make my arguments? We start to look at success in political and public life sheerly in terms of achieving tribal victory, with no sense of what an overarching interest in the general welfare actually is, because we don't see the other side as a part of the general welfare. We are looking to push them out of our reality, forgetting the fact that that is literally impossible unless we descend into a violent sort of civil war. And that, therefore, is where that logic ultimately goes, and it's in its bottommost sort of manifestation. I don't think that we're there yet, but obviously, on the other hand, political violence has become a fact of American life in this moment in a way that it wasn't when I was a kid in the 90s. And obviously, can think of Waco, can think of Unabomber. There were all sorts of things even then, but we are seeing a disintegration of the bonds of trust in America. And what is replacing that is a willingness to go beyond the mechanisms that democratic society has in place, that our republic has in place for us to mediate differences and to move forward on the basis of compromise. Because we do not see ourselves as the loyal opposition anymore so much as we do as enemies who happen to live next door to each other. And in order to impact that problem, we have to rehabilitate our understanding that there are deeper things, deeper values, deeper interests that we share as human beings, and that the recognition of that becomes activated when we are in relationship with each other and can feel what the other person feels in a way that allows us to speak to what the other person is feeling. So it goes all the way to the bottom. We have to start from the ground level in terms of how we interact with each other, how we think about each other. And that's where the work of Braver Angels begins.
As I'm listening to you speak, John, I'm thinking about, in a theoretical sense, I don't think anybody listening to what you just said has any difficulty with the conceptual view of what you're speaking about. And yet, when you take it to a specific, was the election stolen? Did Trump incite the violence justifying an impeachment? As soon as you start talking about specific events and the way people filter things and the way they talk about them, the perspective that you just shared, which is hopefully something all of us can embrace, kind of it sort of goes into the background. And the foreground is like, you know, this rush to the media, whether social media or particular networks, whether you're watching Fox or Newsmax now, I guess, or MSNBC or CNN, or even the major networks, ABC, CBS, and so forth. I think you get your full dose of one way of looking at things. And I've actually been going to the Central Texas Braver Angels meetings on how to influence the media, how to get the media to be more appropriate. And I remember years ago, we used to think of, on the front page, you got the news. Somewhere in so the 13th or 14th page, you see the editorial page. But now the whole paper seems like it's an editorial page.
It does.
And you get things without facts, like anonymous sources taking the space on the front of major newspapers, and all of a sudden you kind of like get inundated, and it's hard to step back and want to be rational, engage in civil discourse. And yet, I think I want to say this to everybody listening: Braver Angel seems to get that right. Now, I don't know. I'm hoping it can spread, and that's partly why I'm having you on. So, why do you think Braver Angels gets it right when it's so hard for so many to get past the inundated, views that are pushed on them from all these different sources?
Well, I do think that we do a great job at Braver Angels. It's not to say that every single workshop and every single event produces a transformative experience for everybody who participates. You know, we do have people who walk away from our events and from our activities disappointed sometimes, and indeed different contexts are more and less difficult than others. But overall, I think that the reason we've been so successful is because we set an expectation for people coming into our events that says that, first of all, it is okay for you to come as you are, like church, right? The idea with church is that, I tell folks, hey, come as you are, and, but you receive the gospel, and hopefully, your life will be changed and so forth, and in a positive kind of way. This is terribly dissimilar. We don't draw hard and fast lines, and we get criticized for this, but we don't draw hard and fast lines, certainly with respect to who's able to come and participate in our mediational sorts of activities. We don't draw hard and fast lines with respect to what somebody believes, not just whether or not they're Republican or Democrat, but whether you're sort of, a radical leftist who'd like to, see private economy abolished, or if you're somebody who's, let's just say you believe in QAnon or something that's, going to be pretty far out there to most of us like that. You are still invited to come and participate in a Braver Angels workshop and share, who you are and why you believe what you believe. So it's a space for people to be honest. Now, it can be challenging being in the presence of people whose beliefs and perspectives are so sort of wildly out of sync with your own that you might think, goodness gracious. I mean, if views like this wind up steering things in our country, where are we going to be? But in peeling back the layer and giving people an opportunity to speak from the vantage point of their own lived experience for the benefit of other people to observe, you do find yourself in the position of being able to experience, the I think sort of therapeutically valuable exercise of being able to share the truth as you see it with folks who generally aren't going to see it the way you do, but who are in a posture of listening, while also equipping yourself and reciprocating that listening to developing a deeper understanding within yourself of, again, sort of where these people are really coming from, past the stereotypes, and how you can actually set about communicating with those individuals when you have to, because now you have a window into this, right? And you get to see the diversity of experiences that accompany our different views. So you may have somebody who believes in QAnon, and you might think, oh, okay, these are all people who are wackos living in their mother's basements or whatnot. But part of what you might discover is that, this person is a plumber who might have been working in my house recently, or this is somebody who may be in my neighborhood or something like that. This is somebody who might be from the town that I'm from, somebody who might have listened to the music that I listened to growing up and shared a couple of the same heroes. And yet this person has gone off this other sort of philosophical path in a one-to-one sort of context. If I realize that there are, 17 points of connection between me and somebody who's got a point of view that I consider dangerous, suddenly if our basis for communicating goes beyond, and I'm using an extreme example with the QAnon piece, so you can swap that out for more, generic examples. But if suddenly we've got 17 points of connection, where originally the only basis for our dialogue is this big thing that we disagree about, then suddenly I can leverage all of these other points to establish a context of trust between us. So that even if, this individual, is just in another universe in terms of how they see the facts as presented, by the media and so on and so forth, how they see the factual reality of our politics, I nevertheless can establish a context that says, you can now see me as somebody who is not your enemy. We have a basis of trust. And now that we have a basis of trust, let's see if we can't go a little further in understanding what reality is. And it's at that point that we can begin to challenge each other in constructive manners so that we can hear what each other are saying, and we can begin the work of redeveloping something of a shared epistemology. Now that's going deep, and it's not going to happen in every workshop to the same extent. Every pairing of individuals is not going to produce that sort of outcome, but it does happen reliably to a certain degree when you bring people together in the right context. Sometimes people are very much transformed by it and find themselves arriving at a more balanced sort of view of who the people are on the other side of the aisle. And then from that, a more sort of humanized understanding of why these people believe what they believe. And then finally, self-reflection. Okay, is it possible that good people, reasonable people, intelligent people, believing something that is at odds with what I believe suggests that there's some reason for me to reflect on the things I believe and why? You need to be able to have that part of the journey is there. And there needs to be a road that ultimately sort of leads to that for some folks, if society, broadly speaking, is going to move forward. But I guess the one final thing I'd add to this is just to say that it's a victory every step of the way. So again, even if a person doesn't find themselves totally transformed in their worldview or their perspective, arriving at a place of greater trust with your neighbors who you disagree with is enough to begin to stabilize the culture of our politics and the working of our institutions. And so every step on that road there is a victory for democracy and a republic, in our estimation.
So that's really interesting. One of the things that years ago, when I was learning about Carl Rogers, I used to be a therapist, and Carl Rogers would talk about the importance of being empathetic to another person. As you're going to be helpful to somebody else as a therapist, as a counselor of some kind, you really have to understand through their frame of reference. You have to see through their eyes what they're saying. But the very scary thing he said about being empathetic is that you begin to identify with how they felt and what their arguments are that are so foreign perhaps to what you believed when you first get into the relationship. And it may cause you panic at some level, because your beliefs that you've held for so long, looking through this other frame, all of a sudden they don't seem so stable anymore. They don't seem so absolute. And now you're being challenged to, as you started to say, I think for a moment ago, you know, your own beliefs come into question somewhat, because if I do have some trust in this other person, if I do think this other person is smart too, and they've got some very different beliefs, then do I just go in waiting for them to finish so I can tell them why they're wrong? Or do I really listen to try to understand why they could possibly be right? And that's scary to a lot of people. So one of the things that strikes me about Braver Angels, just to ask you the question, is I think with some people who are coming to Braver Angels, they're at least open to the idea that they want to listen to the other side. Where in some of my conversations with people, it's very clear they really have very little interest in knowing that there's a reason that they should value an opinion that's so different than theirs in this political world that we're living in today.
And I should have made the statement that that is the one hard line that we draw for participation in our activities and events. You do have to be coming from a place of good faith, ultimately. You know, if you're not, if you want to sort of jump in the mix just to upend it, then there's not too much to be done with somebody who comes into a conversation in that frame of mind, right? But again, I mean, you know, what we discover is that there are people of good faith who believe things that range out across the whole sort of universe of points of view, you know? And so and this leads me to something else that's vital to communicate, because you mentioned the fact that in general, folks listening to us right now, folks listening to this show are likely going to be sympathetic to the sort of idea of, you know, the larger notion that rehabilitating our relationships in America is going to be good for our democratic society, but that when it comes to particular impasses, you know, some of us, you know, believe that what we witnessed was a, you know, free and fair election, as attested to by our authorities across the spectrum of, you know, American institutional life, generally speaking, in a bipartisan fashion. But other folks believe we've witnessed a theft of our free and fair election on the grandest possible scale, just a historic offense and travesty to the integrity of our republic, and something that must be resisted. So how do you build that bridge? And the thing that we have to keep in mind, because many folks will operate on the assumption, or they'll look at what we do and they will say, but wait a second, I can't take the time to build understanding of these people because I have to defeat these people, right? You know, America is in danger right now. The thing that we have to recognize is that there are two projects, really, that we all must be engaged in at all times. There's a tension between them, but there's no contradiction between them. And those two projects are, on the one hand, pursuing your political objectives, standing up and being a voice for the things you believe, whether you're progressive, conservative, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Independent, whatever the case may be, making your argument in the marketplace of ideas and fiercely advocating for the changes you want to see in society, while also advocating for and participating in activities or otherwise conducting yourselves in ways that strengthen the social edifice of society by which our institutions, the institutions of our republic, and our social fabric can cohere. Now, for me, I find great philosophical and spiritual resource for that way of being in the world in the teachings and the philosophies of nonviolence, particularly in the Kingian tradition, the tradition of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And much of that thinking is influential within Braver Angels, and certainly in my work and my point of view. And you know what nonviolence teaches us is that ultimately, well, nonviolence teaches that love is a social value. And King referred to agape love, which you can translate as goodwill, not a love of affection, not a romantic love, a love of liking people exactly, but a desire to see the larger good happen for everyone, even for your opponents. Dr. King taught a mode of social activism and civic and even democratic engagement that focused on emphasizing the dignity even of folks who are standing firmly in the way of justice, as a means of signaling to those individuals that ultimately you are not our enemy. You are not somebody we want to humiliate or defeat in any sort of a personal sort of way. But ultimately, we speak the truth of what we believe. We advocate for the changes we want to see because we want to create a better society for everyone, a community of inclusion for everyone, including you, right? Even though we disagree with each other and even though we are challenging you fiercely and on a moral level, even the outcome we seek is for our enemies to join hands with us in the beloved community, right? Which is, a phrase that King leaned heavily upon. And so, there's a tension there, and Dr. King spoke to that tension. He talked about in scripture how, he was very how the Lord said to love your enemies. He said, I'm very glad the Lord said not to like my enemies. I would find it difficult to, like somebody who would be willing to, willing to club me, willing to, hit me spray me with the fire hose. Find it difficult to like folks like Bull Connor, for instance, and, um, and many others. But love goes beyond that. Love is about goodwill, and being able to frame our activism in that way brings moral power alongside it. And we conduct our work in what in many respects is kind of sort of a parallel manner, emphasizing the need for us to acknowledge the mutual human dignity that is present across the divide as a pretext for fostering conversation that can allow for the possibility of both truth and reconciliation to come to the fore. And so, yeah, that's how we have to, I think, navigate the tension between these two imperatives. The imperative of, on the one hand, pursuing the political agenda in which you believe, but on the other hand, doing so in a way that also allows you to be a part of our ability to sustain community and therefore to sustain democracy together.
So as I listen to you, I think both about Braver Angels and No Labels. And as I think about No Labels and what they've created in this Problem Solvers Caucus, we've had a number of these representatives from the House of Representatives who are in this caucus come before the steering committee and several other groups of No Labels volunteers. And when they talk about their experience of working together, it echoes much of what you're saying, I think, John, where they have a sense of, we are avid supporters of our party when our party is avid supporters of the country. And what we do is when we come together, we both strongly advocate for our positions from our party, but we're listening deeply to one another for really what's the best version of our ideas, whether it's our own or yours from the other side. How do we go forward and make life better for all of us together? And so I think that's the No Labels end of it. The end of all of us as citizens talking more respectfully, with more civility, without the angst of worried about if I say something, is it just going to, create an uproar in my household or with my friends, or, can we talk at all? Because I've seen people just shut down other people who bring something up that's different than what they think. And then the name calling starts on top of that, and then it can get very ugly at times. So one of the things that I'm a big advocate of is more free speech. And one of my good friends is somebody who's the president of Yale University. I work with him collaboratively on emotional intelligence. He's one of the pioneers, a fellow named Peter Salovey. And he at one time was very concerned about the idea that a person with a conservative viewpoint is not welcome on campus at Yale anymore, or many campuses for that matter, because they get, they're vilified somehow, and sometimes pushed back, and they don't get even to be on campus, or they get shouted down when they do show up. And he said the idea of a community at a university is to encourage different points of view so that we engage with others who are really smart too. And together we come up with better versions of what it is that we're thinking about, talking about, acting on. And I think so that I like the idea of braver angels. I think that, it's sort of the metaphor, when the student is ready, a teacher will appear. And so to me, braver angels is the teacher in this instance, in terms of what you're bringing. And I hope more and more people would want to embrace what you're doing. I do know, I did catch a flavor. There is some, religion tossed in this periodically. You see people talking about their religious faith. And I saw some people have a problem with that sometimes, other people who are not religious necessarily. My personal feeling about that is, I'm a very spiritual person. I believe in my religion, but not to the exclusion of other religions. Mm. But I think sometimes people's spirituality comes through their religion. Sometimes it comes through humanitarian, other kinds of humanitarian ways. And it doesn't really matter to me. I mean, what matters to me is people are trying to really hear one another. That the emotion roadmap that I created some years ago to help with this, and the name of the show is about this idea of, if I'm going to say something to somebody that might be controversial in some ways, I want to think about how they're likely to feel. And I want to think about, is that how I want them to feel? Or is there a way that I could create the feelings that I want so that we can actually talk about what I want to bring up? Because if I just bring it up cold, or if I bring it up in the way that I think about it, perhaps it's going to be off-putting to them somehow, and it's going to create some defensiveness, and then we're going to land up in an argument, and that's not where I want to go. So the whole concept of an emotion roadmap is when you've got an important conversation or a challenging conversation to have, you want to think about how you're feeling going into it, and whoever you might be talking to, how are he or she or they likely to feel when you bring this up. If it's not how you want them to feel, and then you don't think it will cause the feelings you want in them, what would be more ideal to feel, and how do you create that? And I think Braver Angels strategies, the methodologies that you put into place, so the people, it's a very structured format that you bring to bear, I think, when you try to help people to talk through these things. And I'm wondering, I guess at this point, I'd like to know if people would want to join Braver Angels, John. What would they likely experience? I mean, because it seems like you're doing lots of different things. I get emails all the time now about all the different meetings going on. How do you kind of sort through that? And what's the recommended strategy if you're kind of interested and you want to know more, but you don't want to be overloaded at the same time?
That's right. Yeah. Well, coming into Braver Angels, you're going to be hit with the community experience, which is to say that a lot of different things are happening within that community. First, let me offer a clarification just in case it's helpful for anybody listening. Sometimes people think that Braver Angels, or wonder if Braver Angels is a religious organization. We are not actually a religious organization. I'll employ some religious metaphors sometimes in talking about our work, just because that's part of my background, part of my story. Braver Angels, as you mentioned earlier on, was originally Better Angels. Better Angels, of course, is a phrase that comes to us by way of Abraham Lincoln in his first inaugural address, talking about the need for us to reach out and revive the better angels of our nature. And the change to Braver Angels happened for a couple of reasons. One, to be perfectly honest, we had a trademark dispute over the name with another group that was resolved amicably. But the word braver came into play because we sort of contemplated the fact that as much as there is an emphasis on empathy being an important, being essential sort of part to our ability to build bridges in the context of dissolving social trust, that ultimately that project was not going to be successful without quite a bit of courage being in the mix. Because frankly, in many contexts, we take a risk by being willing to sort of see and speak to the humanity of the other side. First of all, people who are politically opposite from us may not always reward us for that sort of charity, if you will. You go into conversations with people who are coming from a different point of view. If they look at you as being in a different tribe, and if they look at that tribe as the enemy, they might see you as the enemy, and you may not always be welcomed warmly in those contexts. And then, worse still, you might find yourself being punished by your friends, by your political compatriots and so forth, who look at a willingness to engage folks in good faith on the other side of certain questions as being tantamount to selling out, if you will. Right. And so the term braver came in to signify the need for courage in that work. But in terms of what you experience coming into Braver Angels, well, there are a wide range of activities that sort of that are rooted in developing our skills and characters, forging the context for dialogue and relationship with folks, both of the, of differing political persuasions, but also other folks who think the way we do politically, but who are committed to this larger project. And all of that culminates in some rituals and traditions and larger sort of regularized comings together that occur on the local level as well as the national level, in person and also virtually. And of course, the virtual side of things is accelerated given the lockdown and COVID-19. If you were to join as a member, you might find yourself participating in something called a Depolarizing Within workshop. It is a workshop that focuses in on our internal disposition, our own sort of inner attitude towards folks on the other side. It's a workshop that takes you through questions that you are meant to ask and reflect upon in yourself about that sort of points you to sort of considering, well, am I thinking about folks on the other side of this political question in purely stereotypical terms? Or do I think about the straw man versions of their arguments? Or am I thinking about the strongest versions of their arguments? Do I have people in mind who present a more sophisticated or more thought through kind of perspective on what the other side believes? What are my immediate associations psychologically when I think of Republicans or when I think of Democrats? Do I have a caricature that pops into my imagination? Or do I have a fully fleshed out human being and human perspective that I may disagree with, but that I can ground in an honest sort of understanding of what people, of where people are actually coming from within this kind of space? That's one thing you might experience. We have something called a Skills for Bridging the Divide workshop that focuses in on giving people the communication tools to be able to employ and having constructive conversations across our divisions. And so you'll learn about things like the importance of I statements as opposed to truth statements. When people talk about politics, they very frequently say things like, it's a fact that Donald Trump is the best president for the economy that we've ever had. Or it's a fact that, Barack Obama did more for healthcare than any Republican has ever dreamed of doing, right? And when you put things forward as just a raw fact, even if it is a fact, even if it just so happens that you're completely correct, we tend to put people on the defensive in a way that prevents them from engaging in conversation collaboratively and therefore being available to learn because they're available to listen. But when we frame things in a way so as to say, well, in my opinion, Donald Trump has actually been incredibly good for the economy, and here's why I think that. Or, well, in my experience, Barack Obama did things that really made people's lives better in terms of the effect of healthcare reform, and this is why I say that. Suddenly, we are implicitly acknowledging the human dignity in the other person by demonstrating humility in ourselves. See, the thing is, Chuck, if I engage you from a place of humility, if I act humble in my interactions with Chuck Wolf, what that is going to suggest to you is that I have a certain respect for you that primes me to want to not sort of, assert my own point of view as a priori superior to yours by basis of the fact that, I'm right and you're left or vice versa or what have you. Me showing some degree of humility is my showing some degree of respect. And that invites you into a more comfortable posture in the conversation. And so you learn about things like that in our Depolarizing Within workshop. We have something called a Red-Blue workshop. It's actually our very first offering from Braver Angels. And that is a coming together where we take small groups of folks from the left and from the right, or, as we say, blues on the one side and reds on the other side. It's our sort of in-house lingo. Not to argue and debate about politics, but to speak from the vantage point of their own personal or lived experience in terms of why they see politics the way that they do. It's literally the application of marriage counseling techniques to the relationships between liberals and conservatives and so forth. And in that experience, you'd find yourself on one side You'd start off with introductions. They go from one side to the other. The workshop begins with each side sort of going into a different room with a different moderator. The moderator leads them through the process of compiling a list of all of the negative stereotypes, or at least the top negative stereotypes they see the other side is having about them. They compile that list. They talk amongst themselves in terms of why they think these stereotypes are wrong. But then they also are asked to reflect on whether or not there's a kernel of truth to any of the stereotypes that they can also reflect on. And so with the Reds, with Republicans and conservatives, and libertarians, there's generally a list that it almost always starts with racist at the very top. It may also include things like, hates the poor, anti-science, gun nuts, etc. And for the Blues, their list will oftentimes look like something that may start with, they say we hate America or anti-American. We want the government to run everybody's lives. We're mooching off the state. We hate religion, hate God, etc., hate babies, and so forth. And each side will come together. They'll give their own presentations in terms of why they feel these stereotypes are wrong. But very frequently, in reflecting on the kernels of truth, Reds will say things like, we are not racist. Conservatism has nothing to do with racism. At the same time, we do recognize that there are racist people who vote Republican, who come into our camps, and we should do more to make sure that these folks aren't comfortable in our party. And frequently Blues will say, look, we are patriots. We are people who love America. We believe in the good things about America. We are critical of America because we love it. But there's some folks whose criticism maybe does turn into hatred for our country, and we'd like those folks to start thinking about it perhaps a little bit differently, or that doesn't reflect most of us. And so there are this is the type of reflection that brings to bear. I mean, I could go on and on, Chuck. There's our Braver Angels debate program, gives us an opportunity to challenge each other on issues, but in a communal format where we can pursue the truth together. But what really holds our community together is that people participate in these activities. They have these experiences, but then we come together in our national member calls, like the event that you witnessed just recently, in this month of January. We had new people on that call, but many of those folks were also members. And that was sort of a special event, but we generally have member calls every so often that just brings the community of Braver Angels together, hundreds of folks, if not thousands, in a given occasion. This was not the case this past year because of COVID, but in 2018 and 2019, we had national conventions. The first one was at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. The second was at Washington U in St. Louis. We have delegates who come out, an equal number of folks from the left and the right, hundreds of people who participate together in drafting and ratifying our Braver Angels national platform, which states Braver Angels' mission, our philosophical understanding of that mission, and sort of identifies and enumerates the planks of activities by which we push that mission forward, including things that we have agreed to do in the area of academia, media, government and politics, and on the grassroots level as well. People come together and actually do that together, do that work across party lines, vision casting a more perfect union, and how Braver Angels can work together to get there. And so, when you couple these sort of, these experiences where we kind of get, to use another religious term, baptized into into a different way of thinking about each other, we give each other skills for communication, but then we work together. Then we come together. We have musical concerts. We have musical content. Then suddenly, what you come to realize is that this is a community that we're building that exists to model community and democratic interaction for the larger community of the United States, right? And so that's what you'll experience coming in and being a part of Braver Angels. And, it's a powerful place to be certain.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, John, listening to you and talking about Braver Angels, it seems to me it's a wonderful place for people who are beginning to feel like they want a chance to talk with like-minded individuals who don't agree with them, but want to understand why the other side exists and isn't being critical, but seeking to understand. And that doesn't mean they're going to change what they believe or who they are, or their party affiliation. It's just going to lead to more citizenship, more civility, more respect across party lines, and hopefully across family lines and in friendships. And one of the things I think that, I'd like to just say to people that are interested in what we're talking about today, John, I mentioned to you earlier that there's a group of us in Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York who have been volunteers for No Labels for a number of years, and are partnering with some people who have been volunteers for Braver Angels for a number of years. And we're looking to bring the groups together. We think No Labels and Nancy Jacobson and her vision for No Labels has been fantastic and remarkable in what she's achieved with this Problem Solvers Caucus, and with the bicameral meeting starting now with senators from across both aisles coming together with a number of the people from the Problem Solvers Caucus. So two houses getting together across party lines to try and generate what's in the best interest of the country. I mean, it's remarkable that we're moving in that direction. I think a lot of the skills that they've cultivated themselves are a lot of the skills that you're helping the entire country to build. And I know that Braver Angels is growing pretty rapidly, and we see some synergy in trying to bring the organizations together. If anybody is interested, again, you can write to me. If they want to get connected to Braver Angels, John, what's the best way for somebody to do that?
Well, you can just find us at our website. It's braverangels.org. And there are all sorts of ways to get involved. I didn't get to talk about our volunteer positions and some of the different activities in positions of leadership that people can step into, but you can find all of that information on the website. And you can also follow us on social media at Braver Angels. We're on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all of that. And you can follow me at John R. Wood Jr. On Twitter. I'm on Facebook too, and all of that. But you can start with the website, braverangels.org.
And do you, of all the things that you were talking about, you did say there's certain thing that you might want to do first, but is there a recommended first step in terms of people who just want to get their feet wet or get some exposure? I guess as I'm thinking about who's out there listening and how they're feeling, here's what I'm speculating is that there's some people that would like to know more but aren't willing to take much of their time yet, but they're interested. And then there's a group out there that says, this sounds pretty good to me. How do I get involved? And then there's a group that says, I want the deep dive. I've been waiting to hear about a place like this. I didn't know you existed, and now I want to be part of it, because I'm tired of the community I'm in, because nobody's listening to each other, and I want to be part of a community where people have respectful civil discourse with one another. So if you can think in terms of different groupings, what do you recommend for the different groups?
Yeah, sure. Well, if you just want to sort of keep up to speed with what it is we're doing and get a sense for kind of what our work is about and kind of what it all feels like, you can subscribe to our newsletter. If you go to the website and go to the join page, you'll have the opportunity to join as a member, but you can also scroll down below that and sign up for our email notifications, and you'll get to listen to some of our Braver Angels podcast episodes, see some of our videos, see some of the coverage that comes out about Braver Angels. I have a newsletter that comes out every Saturday, which some folks enjoy reading, and so that's one way to sort of stay apprised, to dip your toe in. But if you want to jump into the deep end of the pool, join us as a member. And we will reach out to you after that with some volunteer opportunities if you want to take advantage of those. But you'll have the opportunity to join our member meetings and participate in some of the gatherings that I've described. So there are a whole bunch of different ways to get involved, but it just starts with knocking on the door. So I encourage folks to do so.
Well, I want to thank you, John. I want to just thank all my listeners who are regular listeners. You've been listening to WPKN 89.5 FM. This is the Emotion Roadmap. Take the wheel and control how you feel. And I'm hoping that you got some idea about how to control some of the feelings you're having about what's happening in our country today, and that you are interested enough to at least learn more, and perhaps even to take a deeper dive into Braver Angels and also No Labels. So if you have an interest in volunteering and feeling like you can make a difference, and you want to feel hopeful and not helpless around what's happening, I suggest you at least take a peek at some of this information that you've been told about today. And I want to thank John for being our guest today. I really appreciate having the time to spend with you. And thanks so much, John. And hopefully we'll be in touch and we'll do more together.
Thank you, Chuck. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks.